to record this session, and we're going to dive right in, and not going backwards, ideally going forwards. In this session, we'll be starting with Georgina Hellett from the LME, who's going to give us a little bit more information on the LME's responsible sourcing requirements, and again, explain a bit more detail how that fits with the effort we are undertaking with the Joint Due Diligence Standard. Georgie, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's good morning for me, but good afternoon for many of you. Thank you so much for having us here today. We're delighted to join the webinar, and it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you all. The LME has been working on responsible sourcing for some time. We started back in 2017, and delighted that the rules came out in October 19. And now we're doing a lot of work with organisations such as the Copper Mark Due Diligence Standard to make sure that our listed brands, those are brands that are eligible to be used in settlement of contracts on the exchange, doing a lot of work to make sure that we're doing everything possible to make sure that those brands can be ready for the rules and for the reporting that starts in 2022. So the next slide just covers some of our drivers for taking action in the first place. The ethical one is very interesting. We felt very strongly that the industry had an ethical responsibility to start taking action, but I should say that the LME was by no means on its own in thinking this, and it's been a huge pleasure to work with organisations such as the Copper Mark and all the metals associations that are co-hosting today, who very much felt the same way, and indeed were putting a lot of pressure on us in the first place to take action, along with many of our brands and other stakeholders. It does feel like the industry collectively wants to do the right thing, and it's been a great pleasure to be able to work so collaboratively with the industry to get to where we've got to today. The LME does also have a commercial imperative. We want to make sure that people taking delivery of metal through the exchange can do so knowing that that metal has been responsibly sourced. And finally, our position in the centre of the metals market between producers and consumers meant that the LME was well placed to help define a route forward that was meaningful, that genuinely made change, but was also practical to implement and recognise the idiosyncrasies of metal value chains. So those were our drivers for taking action, and we worked out very early on that the right way forward was to build on existing initiatives in this sector rather than trying to reinvent the wheel ourselves. So we felt that the OECD's due diligence guidance, which it comprises 5 core steps, which I think are on the next slide, was very well established in the industry, very well respected, and it was very clear that that was the right way to go. So these are the 5 steps here. I won't go through these one by one. I suspect many of you are very familiar with them already. Certainly, I know that all your hosts on this call have become very familiar with them, as have we at the LME. I think the key thing about these steps and what I really like about them is that they do allow for variations in the supply chain. So if your risk framework is different, if you run lower risks or higher risk, there are slightly different routes that recognize that. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So the LME took this and we created our own framework, which we've got on the next slide, which tried to recognize the key steps for us. So on the left-hand side, under the LME categorization of existing initiatives, this is the sort of structure. This is how we envisaged the market. So we took the OECD guidance, that's the top of our pyramid. The next step is for standards such as the Copper Mark Due Diligence Standard to translate that guidance into a standard, which is the process they're going through now. And then the final step at the bottom of that pyramid is for brands to implement that standard. And there are 2 checkpoints for that. So the first one is for the standard to check that it has captured all of the OECD guidance. That's the alignment assessment. So on the right-hand side under LME requirements, that's the alignment assessment stage. And then the second stage is for the check that the brands have correctly implemented the standard. That's the audit stage on the right-hand side. So the LME has drawn up 3 routes for compliance in recognition of the fact that the OECD allows for different outcomes based on your risk assessment. We call those tracks A, B, and C, as you can see on the right-hand side. And the process for complying with those is all slightly different. There are slightly different timelines and requirements, but the key message is that whichever track you pick, you will end up being compliant with both the OECD 5-step framework and with the LME's requirements. Now, obviously, the focus of today is Track A. I'm delighted that the Copper Mark Due Diligence Standard will provide an external standard for copper, lead, zinc, and nickel brands to use Track A. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that on the next slide, which is the flowchart of how to comply with the LME's requirements. So I'll maybe briefly start with tracks B and C, just so you know they exist, but obviously the focus of today is the track A one. So the LME's provided a tool called the red flag assessment, and it's a template that you can use to fill in to work out whether you raise red flags, that is if you're sourcing from a conflict affected or high risk area, known as a CARA. We've provided a route where you complete that and have it audited externally, or you complete that and have it sent to the LME for audit and then publication. So if you choose track C, your red flag assessment template will become public. Those routes are for brands that don't find that they raise red flags when they're doing their step 1 and 2A, which is the risk assessment. That template is available on the LME website for anyone who'd like to have a look at it. I'll go back to Track A now, which is obviously the focus of today. So Track A is available for brands that do raise red flags when they're doing their red flag assessment in Step 2A. It's also available for brands that just want to use a standard to help them comply. So you don't have to have raised red flags to use that. Many people want the assistance and the tools and the guidance that come with using a standard, such as the Copper Mark Due Diligence Standard. That is what Track A is available for as well. You could also use an internal standard, so that's one that your company has developed itself. You would need to get that alignment assessed. That's a formulaic process as prescribed by the OECD. They have tools and methodologies available on their website if you do want to go down that route. If you want to use an external standard, that part of this process will be taken care of for you by your standard, and indeed the Copper Mark is very much in progress on that. So Track A, as you can see, it's down the left-hand side of the slide as you look at it. Like I say, this is if you raise red flags or you just like to use an external standard, and I will assume external standard is the use case going forward for the purposes of today. You have to carry out steps 1 and 2A. If you find red flag risks, you continue with step 2B onwards. You complete all 5 steps, and if not, you go to step 4 and then step 5, which is publishing a report, an annual report outlining the risks you found, the mitigation process you've taken, and so on. That gets made public as part of the transparency initiative, and your audit results will be reviewed. If you're using the Copper Mark Due Diligence Standard, you will be helped and guided through this process. They will provide tools and assistance. They will prescribe a list of auditors that you can use to complete your audit step, and will generally help you through this process to make it as straightforward as possible. I understand that for many people, this is the first time that responsible sourcing concerns have been an issue for the company or something that you've had to address. And it's a lot to take in at the first instance. The LME went through a long process getting its head around all the requirements and how best to meet them. And the advantage of using standards such as the Copper Mark means that, like I say, you get provided with a significant amount of guidance and help to get through that process. So as the current plan, the Copper Mark guidance will go through the alignment assessment process with the OECD. Once that's completed, it will be available for brands to use to meet the LME's requirements. And then I think finally I have a slide on our timelines. So again, the left-hand column here is the timeline for using an external standard. We have not prescribed a reporting period. In any event, we understand that people would like to align their reporting periods with their current reporting period. So in the UK, many people have their reporting periods aligned with the tax year, which runs from April to March. We have tried to be as flexible as possible so people can align their responsible sourcing reporting with their existing reporting timelines. And the Copper Mark will help you refine what your reporting period will be. It may be a stub year the first year, i.e. not a whole year, but in general, the reporting period should be a year. If you are going to use Track A, we at the LME would like to hear from you by the 30th of June 2022 that is your plan to use Track A standard, and which standard you plan to use. I'm assuming for everyone on this call, it will be the Copper Mark Due Diligence Standard. We need the Copper Mark to be recognised as alignment assessed by the end of 2022. And then the first audits of brands will need to be completed a year after that, so by the end of 2023. Sounds like a lot of time now, but I can tell you from experience, it creeps up on you very quickly. So we're very excited that the Copper Mark's making such fantastic progress, and the consultation is already out. The transparency, that's about the step 5 reporting. So we do require step 5 reporting, but the format of that and the detail will be prescribed by the Copper Mark Due Diligence Standard, and equally they will prescribe how often that audit has to be retaken. The final piece from the LME is that we are requiring for all of our brands to take ISO 14001 and ISO 45001, which are environmental management systems and health and safety management systems. We are accepting equivalent certification programs for that, i.e. if you have a program already that incorporates all of the ISO requirements, we will accept that. We are about to publish some information on how you go about establishing your equivalent standard as equivalent, which will hopefully make that very clear. But the aim of that is to be as flexible as possible. We don't want people to have to use ISO if they're already doing something as an alternative. There's no point doing the same piece of work twice. So once we've established its equivalent, it should be fine to continue using that going forward. I think that is it. I think we maybe have one final slide on what the LME's plans are. We've been doing a series of webinars to try and help people get all the information they need. We are going to publish a frequently asked questions list, which we're working on with the Copper Mark and their co-hosts today. At the moment, that needs to go through a bit more review, and then we'll hopefully be able to publish that to the market so that everyone has the same information. We're also publishing information on the kind of auditors that you can use and how you declare a test about the recycled metal you're using. If you're using wholly recycled metal, you are exempt from the main responsible sourcing rules. You will still need to do the ISOs. That was a very whistle-stop tour. I'm aware it's very high level, but I know that Michelle and her team will be going into more detail on what that means in practice. I hope that covers all the information that you needed from me, but I will be around for the rest of the hour and for the questions if I've missed anything. And equally, I think the final slide has some contact details for the LME, so please do reach out to us directly if there's anything that's not clear. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Georgie, for that overview. I'm going to leave the contact information up a little bit, and then happy to continue. So as Georgie said, indeed, in order for brands to do track A, there has to be an external OECD aligned standard, and that is really the origin of this multi-metal collaboration, essentially the recognition that there is no such standard at the moment for copper, lead, nickel, and zinc, and a collective effort to address that gap. So we are working in collaboration with the Nickel Institute, the International Zinc Association, International Lead Association, and the Responsible Minerals Initiative as our main co-issuing partners. So we refer to the document as the joint due diligence standard rather than the Copper Mark due diligence standard, making sure we recognize everybody's contributions here. And we're working closely with the LME, with the OECD, as well as other observers here to make sure we create as much efficiencies as possible. But before I go into more detail on this effort, I would like to give the floor just a few minutes to one of our partner organizations, the Nickel Institute, and I believe I've seen Claude on the call here today to talk a little bit about the reasoning and the motivation behind doing this as a joint effort.
Yeah, many thanks, Michelle. I'm not Claude. I know I appear here as Claude.
Sorry, Mark.
This has to do with the fact that I use the link that Claude shared with me. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Mark Mistry. I work at the Nickel Institute, and I'm supporting my colleague Claude Free, who has the lead on our efforts on responsible sourcing. I want to keep this very brief, as I know that you are interested to listen to Michelle and to have listened to Georgina what concerns the LME requirements. So 3 points from our side that I would like to share. First of all, we as Nickel Institute, on behalf of our members, we welcome and support, of course, this joint initiative when it comes to the due diligence standard, which was initiated by the Copper Mark, and where we have right now zinc, lead, ourselves, and RMI joining. I think the nickel industry has one very critical characteristic, which is we often enough have byproducts in our portfolio. And on the other side, we are a byproduct of other metals. So for us, it is important that we undertake this effort together with the other metals that we are associated with to ensure coherence on the one side, and on the other side, to also ensure that we create synergies with the other metal commodity associations. And the last point I would like to mention is that, of course, the effort that we are undertaking here is to comply with the LME requirements. But we understand this joint initiative with the other metals as a longer journey that we are going in the coming years to fulfill not only with the requirements of LME, but also to see that we find answers to other requirements that we see coming up in the markets. So I'm looking forward, Michelle, to your explanations and to listen to the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark, for those few words. And with that, indeed, let's look a little bit more in detail at what it is that we're doing here with this joint due diligence standard. And the intention or the objective for us with this webinar is also just to make sure you're aware of the public consultation period and a little bit more specifically what we are keen to hear from you from. There are some major areas that we're looking for input from our stakeholders, and particularly from the brands that at the end of the day really need to implement this due diligence standard. But again, before we go into the document itself, let me give you a brief overview of our roadmap and the journey that we're on. So Georgina mentioned the timeline. The 30th of June 2022 is the time by which brands have to inform the LME if you intend to use the track A routes, if you intend to use the standard. So that is our end goal, if you want, is you want to make sure that we have LME's formal approval for a track A standard by the 30th of June at the very latest, so that you're able to make that choice with all the confidence that's necessary to do so. Working backwards from that, we've really started back last year in 2019 with conversations with our partner organizations, trying to understand how can we best come together and, to Mark's point, find a solution that's not metal specific, but really understand the linkages between those different metals, the challenges that we all face, and the fact that they are very similar. And so in early 2020, we formed a working group that's facilitated by the Copper Mark. So you've seen the logos of many of the organizations that are part of this working group on the previous slide. We also have multi-metal producing companies, both from the trading and the producing side in the working group. And that's been just extremely helpful in making sure that we have a good understanding of the realities of what companies are doing and how they're implementing due diligence, making sure that this isn't just a paper exercise, but we're really looking to ground that in the systems companies have already in place. We have then taken a couple of months just to think through the key components of the OECD guidance, and there are some bigger questions that we felt were helpful to think through from the start, and that's what we've done through a position paper. That was really just, if you want, a discussion paper almost for the working group, so we could have a good basis from which to develop a draft standard. For the past, I would say, 5-6 months, we've been drafting the standard itself and have published that at the end of August now for a bit more than a month of public consultation. So again, that's available on our website and on our partner organizations' websites. You can download the draft standard as well as a feedback form that we would ask you to use if you're able to provide us with your inputs and feedback. At the end of September, the consultation will close. We'll go back to our working group. We'll go through the comments and we'll incorporate as much feedback as we can while still ensuring that we're OECD aligned, with the objective by the end of 2020 to have the standard finalized and ready for publication. It will be accompanied by a tool, and I'll speak a little bit more in detail about that tool in the later slides, so that there is a one tool for companies or for brands to use when they want to implement the standard, but also for assessors to use when they want to assess the conformance with the standard itself. So all of that is really intended to be ready by the end of this year. And that is, you know, to Georgie's point, it's to make sure that you have sufficient time as a brand to prepare for compliance with LME's rules. So that gives us 2021 for a pilot implementation, for companies to start looking at the standards, start to understand what does this mean for your own policies, for your own management systems. Are there things that you need to start engaging your suppliers on, information that you need to start collecting. And for us at the Copper Mark, it means we will be going through the OECD alignment assessment. So that will look both at the standard and how the standard is implemented in our assurance process. So we anticipate 2021 to be the year for that sort of piloting, alignment assessment, and really making sure that we have all our I's dotted and our T's crossed, and then by 2022 are able to obtain that formal approval. So that's the journey we're on. What do we expect from this roadmap? Again, a lot of emphasis here on the single OECD aligned standard. And as Mark said, it is primarily there to enable Track A compliance for the 4 metals. But we do, of course, expect that it will significantly help companies reduce the administrative burden, minimize cost for the fact that they can undergo one assessment for multi-metal producers at their site. So it's a site-specific standard. It is applied at site level, and it can cover any material that's produced at that site, regardless of whether that's one of the 4 metals or whether there's other byproducts that may not explicitly be listed in the standard. We've also, in general, looked for the standard to be as open as possible. And so it is currently, in its draft version, it is applicable to any upstream producer or trader of copper, lead, nickel, or zinc. That's on a voluntary basis. Of course, if you're not an LME brand, if you're a mining company that doesn't produce an LME metal, then you don't have to use the standard. But we understand there is some companies, because of maybe customer demands or because they want to demonstrate responsible practices, that would like to have an OECD aligned standard against which they can be assessed. And so we've made sure the scope of the standard is as broad as possible, again, on a voluntary basis, so that we don't exclude companies from this process that have an interest in participating. I've mentioned a tool. Again, we're looking to have a single tool available for companies, both to promote the consistent assessments against standard. We're also looking for that tool to be a resource to help companies in the implementation of the standard, as well as in the identification of conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Of course, we are looking towards the European Union as well for a list of CARAs that will inform, I would assume, more than just the quote-unquote conflict minerals. But in the meantime, in the absence of such a internationally recognized list of CARAs, list of conflict-affected and high-risk areas, we are proposing to use that tool as a shared resource. Georgina already mentioned as well the fact that as a standard owner, as a assurance framework, we are able to guide brands, to help brands, again, because we're working the 5 organizations collectively. We are able to share resources when it comes to training development, to training delivery, making sure that this information reaches the different members of the various associations, making sure that it reaches the brands, and really just looking to provide as much support as we can in helping companies understand the explicit requirements of the standard. So again, I've talked about the standard itself. You can see the outline here on the slide. It is important to mention, and you'll see that a bit later on when we talk about the implementation, that it is a very specific objective. And so as Mark said, of course, we're looking at where the journey is going. We understand due diligence isn't going to be the end of the responsible production, responsible sourcing journey. But this standard has a very specific place in the Copper mark structure, and again, I'll talk a bit more about that, which means it has a very specific scope. So it is really to enable compliance with LME and to enable the implementation of the OECD guidance in the what we call the upstream. So that is from the mining up to and including the refining stage, essentially the production of the metal before it enters the product manufacturing stream. Now that we have the public consultation live of the standard, again, there are a couple of key objectives we're looking to achieve with the public consultation. And you can see two words in bold here. We want to make sure the standard is practical and it's achievable for the companies that need to use it. And so if you are looking at the standard and if you're looking at the feedback form, you will see that there is general areas we're looking for feedback on, as well as some specific questions that will be discussed on the next slide. So in general, what we really encourage everyone to look at, if you have a bit of time to read through the document, is the section, it's section 3, on applicability and scope of the standard. So I've mentioned we're looking to make this as broadly applicable as possible, so that we don't inadvertently exclude companies in the supply chain that have an interest in picking up the standard and using it. So because it's a multi-metal standard, because we are covering all these different types of actors and supply chains, the terminology that we're using in the standard is fairly high level. So for example, we talk about a refiner as a key point in the supply chain, and that's generally understood to be the brand at the LME. But because it is fairly, high level, so that it can cover different metals and it can equally be open should there be other metals in the future that wish to participate and wish to work within this framework, we want to make sure that we are still covering all the companies that we need to cover. And again, we haven't inadvertently excluded anyone from the scope. So we certainly, especially if you're a brand, we encourage you to look at that section to make sure that the companies that are in scope cover the types of operations you have as a brand of the LME, so that you are able to use the standard. And of course, if there is any gaps, or if there's anything that we have, again, inadvertently excluded, to let us know through the feedback process, so we can fix that. Then we have the large section 5, which is the conformance requirements. So that is to the point that again, Georgina made, that is us taking the 5 steps of the OECD due diligence guidance, and it's translating it into an auditable standard. Again, that's the key section where we detail what, as a brand, you will have to put in place in order to conform with the 5 steps. There are some differences in terms of the standard and the LMEs, for example, track B and C. So for example, if you are a company that uses recycled material only, we do still have some basic expectations for such companies in the standard. So if you use 100% recycled input, you are able to use the standard. However, you will have to go a little bit beyond what the LME is currently requesting, and you will have to demonstrate that indeed your material input is only recycled, as well as some basic information on your suppliers that needs to be collected. That are expectations that we understand are increasingly demanded by the market and by customers. And so again, we felt it was important to include that in the standard. And so again, do have a look at the conformance requirement. I would say whether it is to provide us with feedback or whether it is just to start to understand what it is that a brand will be expected to do under Track A, to start to understand the details of what does it mean to have a management system? What are the exact requirements for a policy? What does it need to say? What does it need to include? What is the process for you to identify red flags? What are the kinds of data points that you need to collect, the kind of information you need to collect on your suppliers, the kind of information you need to collect on your inputs, again, whether they're recycled or whether they're primary material, etc. All of that is really outlined in quite a bit of detail. And like I said, we're looking for your feedback on whether that is practicable and achievable. The other general area for feedback is the existing management systems and the extent to which you're able to use what you already have in place. And there, I think for us, it was really important understanding that for these four base metals, really, we are dealing with predominantly large-scale production of these metals. And so we're dealing with many of large formalized companies that have existing management systems in place and that use these existing management systems to work on the risks that the OECD due diligence guidance covers. And so what we are looking to do and to achieve with the standard is to make sure that you can use your existing management system, that you, for example, are able to use your compliance process, your legal compliance process with your suppliers when it comes to looking at risks around money laundering, corruption, or bribery, that you can use your existing management systems related to human rights and how you deal with that at the, for example, mining level. And so it's really intended to say, well, you don't have to have a standalone due diligence system that kind of sits there in isolation, but it's really about recognizing how your different management systems at your company, if you have them in place, how do they link together, and how can you then demonstrate conformance with these 5 steps of the OECD guidance while using those management systems. So again, we're looking for your input, for your feedback here as the very companies that have to implement this over time to understand, have we managed to get that across clearly? Are there things that we can be more specific or more clear about? And really just make sure that it is clear what the expectations are. Of course, any general feedback that you have, we're always interested to hear from our stakeholders on any other points as well that we may not have explicitly mentioned in our forum, and there's some space for you to let us know your general thoughts as well. Now, we do have some specific questions, so it does get quite technical in here, and again, we hope that we can get some feedback from the stakeholders, particularly companies that have been implementing the OECD guidance, maybe for other metals that you produce, or whether you've already started for nickel or zinc or copper or lead. And so again, in the feedback form that's been published together with the standard, you will see some specific questions with a bit of context as to why we're asking those. And one of them is really around the red flags. So LME has decided to use the red flags from the OECD guidance and the supplement for tin, tantalum, and tungsten. And there are really 2 types of red flags. There are red flags related to the origin of the metal or the material that you purchased, and there is red flags related to the suppliers. Now, there's been quite some discussion within our working group, particularly on supplier red flags, and so we wanted to ensure again that we understand, is the interpretation that we have applied in the standard on the red flags, is this something that is practical and achievable? And what we mean here is really, do the red flags and do the way we are asking companies, we're asking brands to identify red flags and to then apply the risk assessment, does that really allow you to identify risks, Annex 2 risks as we call them, so risks covered by the OECD guidance in your supply chain? Is it an effective way to understand where the risks are in your supply chain and to be able to act on that? Then, as with every standard that tries to interpret the OECD guidance, there is a lot of detail on data that is required to be collected to identify those red flags. So what do you really need to know in order to be able to determine if you have a red flag or not? What's the kind of information you need to collect from your suppliers? And then once you've gone through a red flag identification process, and if you have red flags, what are the next steps, and what is the information that you need to collect so that you can actually understand if you have serious human rights risks, or if you have risks related to anti-money laundering or corruption or bribery in your supply chain. And so again, we really look for feedback on, is that the right information? You know, is there anything in there that is just a burden but doesn't actually help you with your risk assessment? And if so, you know, why is that the case? so we can be sure that we strike the right balance here in terms of information that needs to be collected. Overall, the way that the standard is designed and has been developed is understanding that your due diligence is a stepwise process, right? And there is, in our understanding, although the OECD summarizes the entire system in 5 steps, there's a lot of little steps in those 5 steps. And it's really an iteration of gathering more and more information, right? You start with some basic information gathering to understand what is the material you receive and who are the people that you are dealing with in terms of your purchasing. That's pretty basic and pretty standard practice. Then you go a little bit further, and as you start to look at information about where did that material come from, you know, who owns that supplier, who are the right shareholders, or who, etc. And that will help you identify the red flags. Once you have red flags, you go into even more detail. You start to understand really every step of the supply chain. Who exactly is handling that material? At what steps of the supply chain? Where exactly did the material go when it left the mine? What's the transportation route? What are the risks associated with that? And so as you sort of work your way through that data, whenever there is a lack of data or a gap and you're not really able to come to a decision, you're not really able to say, well, I really understand what's happening. I understand there is no risk, or I understand what the risk is, you will go to the next step. And at the end of that journey, almost, if you want, there is the expectation that you need to go underground. So if at the end of your investigation, if at the end of your inquiries with your suppliers, your desktop research, if at the end of all of that, you're not able to do your risk assessments, you're not able to really understand the circumstances in your supply chain, then you may need to go and do an underground risk assessment. And so all of that is kind of behind these 2 points we have here of data required for the red flag identification and factors to trigger the underground risk assessment. The standard's really been designed to try and make it quite clear, how do you go from one step to the next, and when do you have to trigger additional investigation? And so again, we're looking for feedback from stakeholders on whether that's clear. Again, is that practicable? Does that make sense? Is it clear when you have to do an underground risk assessment? Are the factors that trigger it, are they appropriate? Or again, is there anything that we can improve in the current draft? The last point I wanted to highlight here is the definition of identified points. So you will see in the standard, again, we have tried to, not we have tried, but we have defined identified points. In other standards, they're referred to as choke points. And that is a requirement for us to be OECD aligned. So we have to determine what is the identified point, or what are the identified points in the supply chain. And I would say that's probably the section where you have the most differences between the 4 metals that are primarily covered by the standard, just by virtue of how they're processed and how the supply chains work. So again, we strongly encourage the brands to look at the definition of identified points. Give us your feedback in terms of whether that seems to be the appropriate point in the supply chain. Again, are we missing anything there, so that we can take the realities of the brands and the supply chains for those 4 metals into account. Now, I want to take maybe 5 minutes to give you a sense of how the implementation of this standard will work, and then we'll have some time for a Q&A. So in the implementation, again, the official, if you want, after the alignment assessment and where everything is sort of formally in place, that will likely be 2022. However, we do encourage companies to start picking up the standard and start implementing it in 2021 as soon as it is available, both because we want to make sure there is opportunities to learn from the implementation of the standard, but also, again, for brands to make sure you have enough time to prepare for LME compliance. There is quite some information that needs to be collected. I think any company that has started on this journey can confirm it does take a bit of work just to get your systems in place, to start to engage with their suppliers, to start to collect the information you were supposed to collect. And we do strongly recommend that you start that as soon as possible, and really as soon as the standard and the tool are available. The logic then is, again, we're building on what's already out there. So the implementation and the level of conformance of this against the standard will be assessed using existing assurance frameworks. And so I'll be talking today about the copper marks assurance process, but I do also want to flag, of course, that RMI, one of the partner organizations, also has an existing assurance process, RMAP, the Responsible Minerals Assurance Process, which can equally be used because it is a joint standard. So again, we want to make sure you have as many possibilities as there are available to go through this process. So I think most of you are probably familiar with the copper mark, but again, I wanted to give you a sense of how this standard fits into the copper mark more broadly. We are a broader assurance framework. We are tying our efforts to SDG 12 more generally, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal on responsible consumption and production. And at the moment, the copper mark itself is available to copper producers only. And so this is probably the most interesting slide in terms of the implementation of how this all is going to fit together. So in a nutshell, the copper mark covers 32 criteria. So we cover all environmental, social, and governance areas. And like I said, we're open for copper producers. So a copper mine, smelting, or refining operation that participates in the copper mark will be assessed against all 32 criteria, and assuming they have the appropriate systems in place and they meet the requirements, they can then be awarded the copper mark, and they can make claims as a copper mark producer. So that's on the left-hand side. Now, one of the 32 criteria is due diligence in accordance with the OECD guidance, and that's where the standard fits in. So what we've essentially done is we've zoomed in on criteria 31. We've taken that criteria and we are developing this joint due diligence standard that has a broader application. So any copper LME brand, even if they don't participate in the copper mark, any nickel, lead, or zinc brand, or indeed any of the upstream producers or traders of the 4 metal, can pick up just the joint due diligence standard, can go through the copper mark assurance process for just that one criteria, for just that one standard, and then can communicate accordingly. So that means you're not a participant of the copper mark. You wouldn't be able to claim that you're a copper mark producer or a copper mark refiner, but you can go through the assessment. You can use the same quality assurance, the same oversight, and you will, at the end of the day, have the reports that you need to comply with LME. Georgie also mentioned ISO expectations. So if you just do the due diligence standard, it means that you will have to separately report to the LME on your conformance with the ISO expectations. If you are a copper producer and you do the full copper mark, you will automatically comply with all 3 expectations of the LME, because both environmental and occupational health and safety are included in the 32 criteria in a way that is equivalent here. So if you are doing the full 32 criteria, there will be no additional needs in terms of your LME compliance. If you're doing just the due diligence standard, again, you will have to report separately to the LME on your conformance related to environmental and occupational health and safety management systems. So I've mentioned here that the copper mark manages and oversees the assurance process. In a nutshell, that means that, again, you will have access to the tools, to the trainings, to the guidance that the copper mark can provide, that our partner organizations can provide, and our staff can guide you through the assessment process. We do have approved assessors. Again, it is a requirement that you would be assessed using one of those approved assessors. They're identified on our website, and we continue to work with additional firms and individuals to get them approved. So we cover a larger pool of qualified assessors here in different geographies. If you have any recommendations, if you have any assessors that you're used to working with and that you would like to use, please just put us in touch or put them in touch with us. We are, like I said, happy to increase the pool of available assessors, assuming they have the qualifications and competencies that are required. In our assurance process, the assessor is then directly contracted by the company, so you get to choose who amongst the approved assessors you want to use. And then the costs for such an assessment include the fee that your assessor will be requesting for that engagement, and a management fee in terms of the Copper Mark's work to, again, oversee the process and provide those additional resources and guidance and quality management that comes with the assurance process itself. At the end of the assessment, what you will get is 2 reporting outputs. There is a requirement under the OECD guidance that there is a summary report which is public. So there is a summary report that's usually part of the detailed assessment report, or it can be separate, but you will have a summary report that will be published as a requirement of the OECD. And then there's, as always in any assessment, there's a detailed assessment report, and that can be shared with the LME to demonstrate compliance. It can also be shared, of course, with any customers if the company wants to do so. Any of the reports are owned by the company that's assessed. So at the end of the day, it's completely within your own decision-making as to whom and in what form you want to share that information. Now, we've talked a number of times about resources and the tool. So you have a little snapshot of that tool here. Like I said, we will provide a due diligence tool that actually already exists. It's something that the International Copper Association back last year has developed already. At the moment, we are holding off of sharing this more broadly because it needs to be revised and fully aligned with the standard that we're developing. So as soon as the standard is finalized, we will then be updating this tool and making it available to the companies that are looking to participate and implement the joint due diligence standard. Equally, for next year, we are planning, together with our partner organizations, to develop and make available a number of training modules. Again, this will be a lot more of a deep dive in the standard itself, really explaining the conformance requirements, explaining to companies how to implement that. And I would just, say here, there's a lot of existing information already out there. There is a lot of information published by the OECD, by LME, by organizations such as the Responsible Minerals Initiative, that talks about the OECD guidance 5 steps in general. And so there's certainly a lot of good starting points for brands to take. And thus what we are looking for with the training modules is going to be specific to the standard. So it's then really going to be a bit more on how do you implement the standard itself? And again, how do you make sure you comply with LME's requirements? In general, and I hope you can see this through this little webinar series and the public consultation, we are open for feedback and input. We're always willing to have a conversation. If you have any questions, either contact the Copper Mark, contact any of our partner organizations. Of course, if it's compliance related with LME, I will send you back to the LME, but if there's anything we can do to support you or to provide assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out and contact us. So that's it in terms of the overview for our standard. I hope that was helpful, and I do realize we have about 10 minutes left. So let me open the floor here if you have any questions, and again, feel free to use the chat box, raise your hand, or simply unmute your line if you have any questions. Any questions at all from the audience? And this is either because it's the European session and it's still too early for those of us who are not based in Asia, or it was extremely clear. I'm not seeing any questions come through in the chat box. If you have any questions later on in time, of course, as always, like I said, please do feel free to reach out. You can find our contact information on the website. Again, contact your metal associations. They're very closely engaged in this process and do
Michelle,
have information to share. Yes, please go ahead.
Michelle, I think the reason why there are no questions is you basically stunned the audience. Everyone is in shock. Actually, there are a couple of questions in the chat. You can check them now.
I just saw those. Thanks so much. I hope not shocked. I hope the audience isn't shocked. All right, so why are these 4 metals covered? That's a pretty simple one. It is because it's in reaction to LME's compliance expectations. So if we look at the metals that are subject to LME's requirements, these were the only 4 that don't already have an existing standard. So that was the purpose. Now, as you've maybe seen on the collaboration slide, there is quite some interest from other metals that are commonly found as byproducts of these 4 metals. So again, we're keeping an open door and an open mind. But the main purpose and the reason we have copper, lead, nickel, and zinc is because these are the 4 LME traded metals that don't already have an OECD aligned standard. Will the slide deck be available? Again, the recording will be available upon request. I'm happy to share the slide deck as well with the participants. There isn't anything confidential in here. Georgie, is there any concerns from the LME with sharing the slide deck?
None at all, thank you.
Fantastic.
Oh, that will be very helpful. That will be very helpful. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, happy to do so. Another question, so how does this align with the precious metals program? Again, great question. There is a section in the standard that talks about recognition of other systems. So a few ways here. In principle, again, you can use the standard to cover all your metals at the site. Now let's take an example of copper with byproduct gold. If you have gone through for example, an audit for your gold due diligence, maybe using the LBMA, the London Bullion Metal Association, which is itself an OECD aligned standard and system. What that means is we do not re-audit everything that's already been assessed. So essentially we recognize the management system that's been assessed and the gold, the due diligence that you do on your gold supply. In this case, the only thing that would be left is to verify that indeed that same management system is also implemented on your copper supply chain. So it's closing that gap at the site in terms of what's not already been assessed. But as long as you have, and I have to stress here, as long as you have an OECD aligned, so an equivalent system in place, as long as that's the case, then we can recognize that fully and you don't have to be re-audited for it. If you have gone through an assessment that hasn't been OECD aligned, hasn't been found to be OECD aligned, then typically what happens is that information will be taken into account in your assessment. So it'll be expected that that reduces your audit burden, but it'll be more difficult to have it formally recognized. And in answer to the question in the chat box, if the LBMA silver guidance is OECD aligned, I don't think it has gone through a formal alignment assessment. So there isn't a formal determination to that extent. And I unfortunately can't speak to the LBMA's plans in regards to whether that will happen over the course of the next 1 or 2 years. So I may have to refer you to the LBMA in terms of any plans to have that formally reviewed for OECD alignment. Any other questions?
Hi, Michelle, can you hear me? This is Finny Tan from Assist Global.
Yes, I can. Hi, Finny.
Yeah, just I'm very interested in the shared resources about the CARA. As well, right now, this some of the industry program will also have the CARA for the minerals assurance program. So I would like to understand. So, can you help to elaborate a little bit about the shared resources of the CARA and what is the differences against the other resources right now in the industry provided by the industry audit program? Mm-hmm. Because right now, for the most of the companies, for the assurance program, it leaves the auditee to determine the CARA instead of the there's no specific guidance. So which actually is a difficulty for the auditee, for the companies to select resources, criteria to make the determination. So I would like to understand a little bit more about your shared resources about the CARA. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you, Finny. Yes, so I can confirm it's the same approach for this standard, where at the end of the day, the decision to say something is a CARA or it's not a CARA, that decision has to be taken by the brand. Again, this is an OECD alignment issue. We are not able to just tell you, here are the CARAs, but as a brand, at the end of the day, you're going to have to reach that decision yourself. So similar to existing systems, what we expect is that as a brand, you are able to demonstrate what are the resources you've taken into account, what is your methodology to determine if something is a CARA, and then what is your conclusion. So you have to tell us, well, here's what I've looked at, here are the things that I've considered, and then these are the countries that I consider, or the areas within countries that I consider to be CARAs. Now, when we say resources, indeed, we recognize at the moment there is a number of different service providers and tools behind firewalls, I believe, for all of them, that paid walls, sorry, not firewalls, behind paid walls, that offer maps or resources to determine a CARA. Similarly, the tool that the copper industry is currently using and that we will make available for companies for the standard includes a very similar resource. Again, it's based on very much comparable or many of the same indicators than others are using. And it essentially gives you a list of countries that are ranked based on these indicators that then at the end of the day, as an implementing company, you can look at and say, okay, well, I consider all the red countries to be CARAs, or all the red and orange countries to be CARAs, or the first 20 or the first 50 or whatever it is that you determine in your methodology. So it's a resource to try and create consistency in terms of how the companies that implement the standard understand CARAs. One thing I will again highlight here is we are all waiting for the list of CARAs to be published by the European Commission. Once that list is publicly available, it is our expectation that it will rapidly become the reference list for these various assurance processes and these various standards. And much in the same way, we would refer to that list as well, in particular if it is recognized by the LME as being the main reference list on how to determine CARAs. So we're hoping that some consistency will be seen once the EU's published their list. Right, I notice we're at the top of the hour here. So again, thank you all very much for your participation today. I will let you hop off here and get on with your work day or with your evening if you're based in Asia. Thanks so much for participating. As mentioned, we will share the slides with you all after the presentation here. And as always, if you do have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact us anytime. Thank you so much for your interest and for your time today. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you.
Bye.